This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Cassidy Randall. Cassidy is a journalist and author whose work explores the intersections of adventure, history, and the natural world. Her new book is called 30 Below, the Harrowing and Heroic Story of the First All-Women's Ascent of Denali, and it tells the gripping true story of 6 women who in 1970 became the first all-female team to summit North America's tallest mountain. It's a meticulously researched, beautifully written account that brings long-overlooked voices to the forefront of mountaineering history. As someone with a deep personal interest in Denali, I was especially excited to read this book and to speak with Cassidy. In our conversation, we talked not only about the origins of 30 Below and the individual women at the heart of the story, but also about Cassidy's career as a journalist, how she got started, the path she's carved through the world of long-form storytelling, and how she approaches writing with such clarity, depth, and purpose. She also shares insights into her research process, the challenges of shaping complex narratives, and the broader importance of telling stories that have often been overlooked or dismissed. Whether or not you've ever set foot on a glacier, 30 Below offers a deep dive into universal themes, resilience, purpose, and the human desire to explore. It's a story about ambition and endurance, but also about complexity, contradiction, and the ways women have long carved space for themselves in places that often excluded them. Cassidy brings these histories to life with nuance and empathy, honoring the individuality of each woman while raising timeless questions about legacy, belonging, and what drives us to push beyond our limits. Thanks so much to Cassidy for writing such an amazing book and for taking the time to chat with me. I hope you enjoy. Cassidy, you and I and your super cool husband, Ben, had so much fun last year at the Old Salt Festival. And I think that might have been the first time I heard about this book was coming out. And I was so excited to read it because I'm a super fan of Denali and all things Alaska. And we had a fun time. I feel like we were just laughing for 3 days straight.
I love, yes, the Old Salt Festival. Can't say enough good things about all the amazing people it brings together.
It was great. And so we'll try to keep the jokes at least somewhat subdued during this because I want to talk about 2 things. One, the amazing book you've just put out in the world, 30 Below, and then about your journey as a writer, journalist, adventure badass. Like I want to talk about it all. And the trick will be doing that without taking 4 hours of your time. But I want to talk right about the book just because I loved it. As I said, I mean, I think I've had a hard time finding books about Denali that I think are accurate reflections of what I think about when I think about Denali. And I feel like there are 2 on earth that do it justice. One is a short story by Jon Krakauer called Club Denali, and the other is called 30 Below by Cassidy Randall. So I loved it, and I'd love to know, how did this capture your attention? Because you're in the middle of the world of adventure. You're seeing cool stories and interesting stories. How did this come into your brain so that you were like, yeah, I want to devote a lot of time to writing this book?
First, I have to say that I am absolutely thrilled that you put me in company with Jon Krakauer. Thank you.
He's in company with you.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. So this story, I would love to say that I stumbled on it on my own, but I have this incredible agent who has this almost magical capacity for finding good stories and then championing the hell out of them. And this one, she sent me, probably 2 years ago now, maybe a little more, this email, and it just had a link and one line. And the link was to this National Park Service blog post. And the one line she wrote was, "Is there a good story here?" And I clicked on this link, and it took me to this post that was a 50th anniversary celebration commemorating this first all-women's climb up Denali. And I had never heard about this. And I have been working in, writing stories about adventure and women's issues in the outdoors for years by this point. I had never heard of this groundbreaking climb. And what's more, in my previous life, I was an activist working in environmental health at the intersection of women's health and the environment. And I knew a woman named Arlene Bloom, who was in this blog post, as this just really accomplished chemist who had done all of this work getting toxic chemicals out of children's pajamas and furniture and cosmetics. And she shows up in this blog post as this incredible mountaineer who was part of this team. So I had this jarring worlds colliding moment. And now I'm embarrassed that I even say that I had no idea she was a mountaineer, because she's one of the most well-known mountaineers in, women's history and in climbing history in general. And then what really got me, though, to see if there was more of a story here was this woman who ends up being essentially the main character of the entire book, Grace Holman. And when I kind of, when you're starting to write a nonfiction story, you have to see how much really exists. Is there enough to actually write a whole book on? And the first thing when I started looking up Grace Holman that came up was, one, the fact that her entire life, along with her husband, Vin Holman, who was a very well-known Alaskan mountaineer, was her whole life is archived at the University of Alaska in Anchorage in this special collections. And what comes up first is this sort of story that somebody had written when they had first gone through their archives. And it was this heartbreaking love story between Grace and Vin. Just incredible love story with this really tragic ending. And that is what hooked me, where I thought, oh man, there is so much more here than just a story about a single climb up Denali. There's a story for every single one of these 6 women and how they fatefully came together. Almost, you could not write this as fiction, the way they found each other. All these stakes they were carrying up the mountain that were so different, all the different reasons they wanted to do it. And then finding out that it wasn't just like, yay, this is a great story about how they just all wanted to do this together. It was an epic survival story, and nobody had told it. So I was just floored about this, and that's why I couldn't stop thinking about it.
Yeah, well, I feel like it hits all the things that I love about reading and about books. I love biographies. I love really interesting, kind of crazy people that are super curious and super accomplished in everything they do. And so it's like, I was thinking, even if you took out the climbing part of this, all these individual women have such amazing stories on their own that, the climbing obviously kind of brings them all together, and that's a amazing adventure tale. And it's another chapter in their really interesting lives. But I thought it was, you perfectly blended together like hardcore adventure tale with just stories of very, 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 very interesting people. And you weaved it together in a way that was like, there's so much detail in there, but it's also so fun to read. And I want to, at some point, I want to ask you about how you even thought about structuring that. But kind of the main, I would say the main character, tell me if I'm wrong there, is Grace, who you mentioned. And I was wondering if you could just kind of give an overview of her. I mean, everybody needs to read the book to fully appreciate, but her life was just so interesting. She's such an interesting person with this kind of, a real wild outlook on life that is interesting, would be interesting now, but in her time, it was even more rare. Could you just kind of give a thumbnail sketch of her?
Yes. Grace is just this magnificently stubborn and determined woman. And giving a snapshot of her youth gives you this idea of who she was, right? So she was raised in Holland. She chose to go to university for a medical degree at a time when less than 4% of women were, or 4% of doctors were women. She wanted to be a surgeon. And so she's 16 years old, to go to university for this medical degree in Berlin in 1942 in the heart of World War II. While Germany is occupying the Netherlands, that was just the best university. And so she wanted to go there. And so she falls in love there with a fellow doctor. They get married. They have a child together. And 2 years after they've been married, he is conscripted as a battlefield doctor, is shot in combat, and she's widowed and pregnant with their second child. So she finishes out her medical degree, single parenting a 2-year-old pregnant. When the bombs start falling, she has to run for bomb shelters while she's hauling her toddler, running with her pregnant belly. And when she finishes up her degree, her mother hops on a bike from Holland, because they were poor, they didn't have money for a car, hops on a bike from Holland, cycles into Germany, finds a bike for Grace, And the two women cycle the two baby girls out of Third Reich wartime Berlin. Like, just amazing. You could do a whole story just on Grace. And so eventually Grace ends up in Alaska. She learns how to mountaineer in Europe, and she's reunited with these huge mountains from her youth. And she starts climbing alone because she doesn't really know anyone. And she does all of these solo first ascents. She is one of the very few women who knows how to operate and run a snowmobile. She hunts. She'll, go for a ski and then bag a ptarmigan for dinner on the way home as she's snowmobiling out. Just like badass woman. And it's in Alaska that she meets this fellow climber named Ben Homan, who actually ends up being 10 years her junior, but her absolute love of her life. Grace at the time, she's 39 when she meets him. She's already been married twice. She has 2 grown daughters. And this man is just the absolute love of her life. So it sets up this just fascinating sort of past that Grace has, and really gives, I think, readers a snapshot of who she is, so that as the book progresses, you understand why she starts making decisions that maybe you don't agree with. That's one thing I love about Grace, and all of these women in general, is that they're all on their own different journeys, and they are all complex and complicated, especially in an era when, and maybe even still today, I would say, in this era when women were only supposed to play these roles that were historically assigned to them, right? We were supposed to be one-dimensional, and we all know what those roles are. They're princess, witch, lone heroine, damsel in distress. You're either supposed to be totally likable or you're villainized for being unlikable. And none of these women fit those roles. And I love that.
I loved it too. There was a line, I believe, when you were describing Grace, and I think somebody referred to her as being, what was it? Abrasive, aggressive, and stubborn. And you made, and right when I read that, I had the same thought that was in your next sentence. You said that, a lot of times if somebody's talking about a man, those are considered pretty cool traits, and like, oh, this guy's a badass. Whereas, in her day, and even sometimes now, I think those types of characteristics are seen as a negative in women. And I thought that was, I think about that all the time, especially with 2 little girls. Like kind of the double standard there.
Totally.
Early in the book, so you give us kind of the overview of Grace and some of her background, and then you gave there's a really interesting kind of history lesson about the women climbers up until that point, because obviously these women went off and did something that had never been done before, but there had been plenty of women climbers before. And I learned so much, even down to the restraints on the type of clothing that was available for them to do these type of expeditions. Could you talk a bit about the state of women in climbing, up until this point?
Yes. So there, as you said, have been quite a few women who were breaking into the mountaineering world before these women tried Denali in 1970. But I just want to give some context too, that by 1970, that didn't mean that this was easy for any of these women. Like, we had sent men to the moon by 1970, and women had not stood on the highest points on Earth, which is wild. And popular belief held that they were incapable of withstanding high altitudes, savage elements, carrying heavy loads, and everyone knew their periods made them weaker and prone to hysteria on a monthly basis, right? And there were a lot of episodes that crafted that narrative and why it persisted. So, you start with, like you said, the clothing. One of my favorite stories is Elizabeth LeBlanc was an Irish alpinist climbing at the turn of the 20th century. And she just scandalized, prim Victorian society. And by going out without male chaperones, she didn't have any male family members climbing with her. And she would climb with her guides and spend the night with her guides in huts, right? Just like, what a scandal. And she also was known for shucking her skirt, because women were expected to climb mountains in these heavy skirts. And just imagine that they're wet and, there's snow piling up on them and they're around your ankles. It just seems awful. So she would shuck her skirt once she was out of sight of huts or towns, and just climb in her bloomers and hide her skirt somewhere. And she came back from a climb once to find that an avalanche had carried her skirt away and disappeared. And she had to hide behind a tree back in town while her guide went to her hotel to try to find her something else to wear. And he comes back carrying an evening gown, just like parade back to her hotel wearing an evening gown after she's climbed a massive peak. And that's sort of a tame story, though. By 1959, there were all women's attempts at high peaks, albeit with porters, male porters, and guides. And even though men in the Himalaya and the Karakoram and those high reaches would also employ porters and guides, when women did it, it was just, another example that they were too weak to do it on their own. So another double standard. But in 1959, Claude Cogan was leading the first all-women's attempt on Cho Oyu, which is the 6th highest peak in the world. And an avalanche swept away Cogan, a few of her teammates, and a few of their guides at high camp before they reached the summit. And I think the day hadn't even ended when this British reporter, Stephen Harper, called it yet more evidence that women were unsuited to face the avalanches and white hell of a blizzard-torn mountain, right? And then I think one of the most outrageous stories is in 1961, which is only 9 years before this Denali climb. It's not that long ago. And also, it's not that long ago in general, right? This is fairly recent history. But in 1961, Irene Miller, this really accomplished American climber, went with her husband to Makalu Base Camp. Her husband was joining Sir Edmund Hillary's expedition up Makalu, and she wanted to join. And Hillary not only forbade her from leaving base camp, one of the members of the team told her that she had to be willing to sleep with all the men on the team, as in have sex with, if she wanted to join the expedition. And she had gone to base camp with her husband. I mean, just outrageous stuff. So that's what these women were facing down when they were preparing to climb in 1970. And almost all of them, at least 3 of the main characters, I hesitate to call them characters, 3 of the main women in this story had been denied on expeditions for absolutely ridiculous reasons. So they knew what it was like to be told no.
It's funny, in my notes that I'm looking at, that as I was reading the book, I had this one heading with bullet points under it, and it says infuriating parts. And that's the part about the sleeping with people.
Yes.
I mean,
who says that?
Well, and then I think that brings me to another question I had, or another one of the climbers that I really I love learning about, Margaret, and how early on when you're describing her, you talk about how she was kind of repelled from a lot of the language that was the common language for climbing mountains. Like, we're going to conquer the peak, and we're going to, this kind of real tough guy conquering type mentality. And she had the mentality of more like, trying to be in tune with nature and not this kind of warlike vocabulary when it comes to mountain climbing. And I want everybody to read the book, but I was wondering if you could also just give a brief character sketch about Margaret, because she's a badass.
Margaret, I think, ends up being my favorite at the end of the whole story, because, as we said, people go through some serious transformation, so that by the end, some of the women that you may love in the beginning, you want to strangle. But Margaret, my God, and just for a snapshot now. So Margaret's a New Zealander. She lives in Christchurch. And I went and spent time with her. She and Arlene are the only 2 women still alive from the climb. And she is 90 now. She was 88 when I spent time with her. And I just want to be like Margaret when I grow up. She's starting to lose her mobility only just now, because she took an injury to one of her legs on a cycling trip, a multi-day cycling trip she took when she was 88. And she's so pissed off about losing her mobility, she refuses to use a walker, and instead she has a hiking pole in every room of the house. Just such a cool woman, so with it. And so Margaret was climbing in New Zealand also at a time when there weren't that many women who were climbing. But to Margaret, it wasn't really that. She didn't really notice it that much. It wasn't something that bothered her. And she did read about other women who were climbing and admired them, but not more than she admired any men. And it's interesting, when she came to the United States to start on this Denali trip, she and another climber, an Australian woman named Faye Kerr, were tasked with driving all of the team's gear from San Francisco up to Talkeetna. And there were these fearful, they would run into these truckers on the highway in Alaska or in Canada, in the Yukon, just totally remote. And the only places to stop would be these truck stops to get cheap breakfast. And she would run into all these people in North America who would be like, "You're climbing Denali? Like, what, are you doing this for women's lib?" And she would be like, "What? Nobody ever told me that women weren't liberated," So just a totally different mentality, which was really cool and a different perspective that she brought. But so Margaret had just this kind of series of fateful events where she almost died several times, climbing around New Zealand, climbing in the European Alps. And it's not until she actually is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, just flailing. She's been wanting to go on a proper expedition, she calls it, for years. And she actually was, though, denied from an expedition to Antarctica, although she was training as a geologist and could serve not just as a mountaineer who offered safety on the ice, but as a trained geologist. And she had been barred from this expedition because there were no women's toilets on the plane from Christchurch to Antarctica. So she did have some things that she was wrestling with for her gender, but all she wants is to go on a proper expedition. And right before this invitation comes for the Denali climb, she is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And her doctor tells her that she has a very finite amount of time before she might end up in a wheelchair. And for Margaret, all she wanted was to climb mountains and travel the world. And it was just this prison sentence for her. And then out of the blue, through another sort of fateful path, comes this invitation to climb on Denali, this proper expedition. And Margaret she is so down to earth, just brooks no nonsense, really, really experienced, really cool headed. And I think ends up being one of my favorite people in the entire book.
When you were speaking with her or doing research on the other women on the trip, so many of them had these really scary experiences of either getting hurt or almost dying, avalanches coming down right where they had just walked, all this crazy stuff. Were you able to figure out or kind of get a idea of what kept them so focused on continuing to do it? Because I would think a lot of people, you have enough of these close calls, you're like, all right, I'm good. But it seemed like so many of these people, particularly Margaret, were just driven to continue doing it. And I was wondering, like with Margaret, for example, could you figure out what was behind that? Like what was driving that? I mean, I know you can't read their mind, but and all of them are different, but I'm just curious.
For Margaret, for someone like Grace, who had almost died a few times also, Arlene had been in situations where she was near people who had almost died. There is this, like for Margaret, I know that's where she felt most alive, where she felt the happiest was in mountains, was discovering new things, discovering new ways that her body could move, seeing what was on the other side. She had this pull just to see what was at the top. What could you see at the top? And for Margaret, it always seemed like there was some Shangri-La on the other side of a peak, right? And maybe the next peak was where she would see it. This just almost indescribable pull. So that the fact that these high risk pursuits in the adventure world, that where we kind of walk this fine line between death, and I mean, death and loss are inherent in a lot of these pursuits. I mean, you think about that, mountaineering, whitewater kayaking, really intense ski alpinism. That's just, it comes with the territory. And it's almost this wrestling with the fact that this thing that makes us feel most alive also could deliver so much grief or mortal risk, right? It's a really interesting balance, but I think in the end, there's so many things about it that, this ultimate presence, this fact that everything else falls away, and all there is to be there and to keep yourself alive and see what you can do and to be there for your partners. And I mean, it's so tantalizing, right? And I know for Margaret, that was the case.
There's a part, I have it marked here it's on page 24 in the book, in the version I have, which is probably different from the one a lot of people who are listening to this will have, but, where there's like 3 paragraphs about why people climb mountains. And I'll encourage people to look that up, because I thought that was, I underlined it, right? Yeah, it's at the end of chapter 2. And I thought that was some of the best writing about explaining why people want to do this. One more question about Grace, since you got to talk to her. Was there, it may be hard to know at age 88, but was there like a discontent to her? Because it seems like a lot of people who choose to do these hard things, whether it's, ultra running or climbing big mountains or anything that's kind of like what I think of as elective suffering. You don't have to do it, but you do. It's almost like there's a underlying discontent. They're not, because people that are like super chill and happy and just kind of everything's great, more times than not, they're not drawn to these kind of things, is people that are maybe a little bit, I guess discontent is the right word. Did you pick up on any of that either in person or in your research about her or any of the other ladies?
Yeah. Do you know what's interesting with Margaret? I never did. And not
That's
in
cool.
those early days anyway. She had this really, as far as I can tell and what her history was, this really pure call to be out. And it wasn't until later that she, I think, started carrying around some trauma later in her life. And I do think that's a rare thing, though. Most of the other women who were part of this climb did have other demons. I don't know if we escaped necessarily, but it's interesting. I'm writing a piece right now for The Atavist, and it's about a woman named Lena Roat. And Lena was the only woman who was part of one of the last great exploratory expeditions left on the continent, on North America in 2000. She was on part of the Coast Range Traverse, which was this bid to be the first to traverse the Coast Range that goes from Vancouver all the way north to Alaska. And nobody had done it. It was just considered, just all these veteran ski mountaineers said it couldn't be done. It was too remote. I mean, just unholy elevation gain, too technical. There was no way. And she thought it could be done. And this whole story, though, it's that expedition and the expeditions that followed are a backdrop for mental health and grief and loss and the void that a lot of people are trying to fill with these kinds of high risk activities. And I think that it's really common, and I think about even why I do, and I have some baggage about why I want to go out and do things that might, where I can prove myself or I can be totally present and let everything else fall away. And there's nothing wrong with it, right? But I do think it's why these sort of mountains call sort of misfits and sages and just, the trappings of society fall away and there's nothing else to fitting in. And so, I think there's quite a lot to that. But I kind of still want to turn it back on you, Ed, because you've climbed Denali.
No. I get to ask the questions.
But I want to know why you do it. I mean, and Denali was not easy for you. You talked about how cold it was and what it did to your body, but you would still probably go back.
Yeah, and it took me 2 times, because the first time I went, there was this. I won't say the name of I went with a guide service, so I had it super easy compared to these women we're talking about here, and I had all this fancy equipment, a super nice sleeping bag and all that. So it's nothing like these women. But on my first trip, spent probably 22, 23 days and was on the way to the summit. And one of the guides who had a bad attitude the entire trip and been struggling with altitude the entire trip really got incapacitated at the top of the head wall. And so like at 19,000 feet or so, and sick and stumbling around and couldn't talk. And the head guide had to make a decision. And he's like, all right, this guy's got to go down. And it was super windy and cold. And he goes, Ed, you have to help the other guy take him down because you're the youngest and you can come back. And I mean, he had to make that call, and he was a badass and he's cool. I got ultimate respect. And so I had to help get this guy back down to the 17,000 foot camp. And, while everybody else went and summited. And so I was mad, but also like understood and all that. But thankfully the guide service paid for me to come back the next year. And so I went the next year and made it. But I'll tell you, that year between when it happened, or when that happened, and when I went back, there was like a madness to me almost about training and getting ready to go back. And I remember that my tent mate on the second year was like, after the fact, he was like, dude, I was kind of worried. Like, you were kind of crazy. Like, I thought you would like kill yourself trying to get up there. And I don't know, I don't know. I like, at a most basic level, it sounds boring, but I like goals that scare me. I'm not interested in anything unless I'm scared.
Interesting. I know. It's hard to explain sometimes.
Yeah. Weirdo. I'm just a weirdo. That's the answer. So there's this amazing kind of all these different events and different connections between people allow this team of women to come together to go on this, first all women's trip. And people need to read to understand all that. But for folks who aren't familiar with climbing big mountains like Denali, could you talk about the process? Because I think some people, if you've seen shows about Mount Everest and all that, you understand the process. But I think a lot of people think climbing a big mountain is like climbing a 14er in Colorado or something. It's just a big push, but it's far from that. And it's almost like you climb the mountain 2 or 3 times just to get to the summit. So could you walk people through what is involved in climbing a mountain like this?
Yes. And Denali was a bit of a special case by 1970 when this climb took place too, because 3 years before, and this is where the book opens, is with Grace on this expedition in 1967 on Denali. And she's the only woman on this Mountaineering Club of Alaska expedition to get to the summit. And she's halfway up and she actually starts experiencing some altitude sickness, but she won't admit to herself that's what it is for various reasons. And this storm breaks over the top of the mountain. And where they are halfway up, it is still so strong that they are watching the wind pick up these 20-foot slabs of ice and just fling them around like kites. And in this break in the storm, they see these 3 men kind of stumbling down the mountain. And they know that it's from this expedition that they know has been a couple weeks ahead of them. And they gear up to go meet them in this break in the storm. And they find the leader of that expedition. It was called the Wilcox expedition. Joe Wilcox was leading it. And he said that they had summited and left several of their party who still wanted to summit at the top. They were coming down. They had waited for the rest of their party kind of lower down. And they were all deteriorating in health. And when the storm hit, they knew they had to get lower. But basically, once this storm had broken over the top of the mountain, they hadn't been able to make contact with their teammates. And what ended up happening, that Grace ended up being part of this tragedy that is still the worst tragedy to ever hit Denali, that all 7 men who were part of the Wilcox expedition who had tried to summit died on top of the mountain. And that storm, and this is not a typo, it's not exaggeration, winds were estimated to be 300 miles an hour at the top of the mountain during that storm. And so at that time, the National Park Service was actually really involved in climbing Denali, and you had to apply to the Park Service. You had to show your credentials that you could handle this. And so they also, after that expedition, ensured that there were these huge lists of things that you had to take up the mountain. You had to be prepared to be on it for at least a month. And you had to be sure that you had what was called backup, which was either the Alaskan Rescue Group agreed to come and get you, or you had another party climbing somewhere near you on the mountain and you agreed to be each other's rescue should you need. Because at the time, rescue on Denali was just this pie in the sky idea. There were no helicopters that could fly that high. Nobody was coming to get you if you collapsed at the top of the mountain, right? Even in good weather. And so climbing Denali in 1970, I mean, even now is a huge endeavor, but in 1970, you had to carry, this was not light and fast alpinism, right? This was, you were climbing a mountain siege style where you were carrying hundreds of pounds of food on your back to create these stocked camps on your way up. So you were piggybacking yourself over and over. So all of your gear would get dropped at base camp by a Cessna. Or if you were Grace in 1967, you decided to do it from like Wonder Lake at the bottom.
I couldn't believe that. That is so insane.
I know.
You can wash down the river and everything. I mean, that's wild.
I know, just insane. But yeah, so you're just carrying hundreds of pounds of food and gear and backup gear. You have backup of almost everything just in case. And none of this is light, right? I mean, even the snowshoes that people were using were these 3-foot monstrosity contraptions and these huge frame packs. And so, yes, by the time you have gotten to the top of Denali, if you are so lucky that the weather allows you to, or your body allows you to, you have been on the mountain for quite a long time. And the air, and you can speak to this too, Ed, the air at the top of Denali, because it's the highest polar mountain, is actually thin like Everest, even though Denali isn't as high as Everest. And you've been on the mountain for longer than most people who are climbing Everest, because the mountain actually, because it sits so low on the tundra, it gains 6,000 feet more from its base than Everest does. So you're on the mountain for a really long time. It's cold. It's just constantly cold. And you have been carrying all this gear so that by the time you get to the top, you've probably actually climbed the mountain several times because you've had to carry all this gear up nonstop. So it is a huge endeavor.
Yeah, it's the thing I always think about with these big mountains is that, you know, like if you're preparing for some kind of race or endurance event or something, you're all rested up and you should be like perfectly primed so that when you start the race, you're as healthy as you've ever been, you're as fit as you've ever been. But on these big mountains, you spend 3 weeks just your body getting destroyed and deteriorating. And so by the time you actually go for the summit, you're in the worst shape that you've been. You probably lost 20 pounds. I know I did. Just lost all this weight, and you're tired and you haven't slept and you feel like you have the flu. And then it's like, all right, now this is the important stuff. Let's go. This is the hardest part, and you're sick. Go for it. It's just, it's a weird, very weird pastime. I don't understand. Another thing that I really loved about this book, and you're much more in the world of writing and books than I am, but from my perspective, it seemed that a lot of popular books about women in the outdoors, I'm not saying all the books, but the ones that seem to get a lot of attention are stories of women who are going out on an adventure as some sort of journey of transformation. Like I always think about the book Wild by Cheryl Strayed. I mean, great book. Cool story, amazing accomplishment, but it was, she had a really chaotic life and then went on this trip and had adventure and then, had transformation. But I don't feel like there are many books out there that are, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that are women adventure books just for the sake of adventure. You could take out the part about them being women and it's just a straight up adventure book, but was that at all of interest to you when you came across this story, kind of adventure just for the sake of adventure that when they happen to be women?
Yes, because I could count on one hand, probably I could name maybe 1, 2 mainstream adventure exploration books. And when I say mainstream, I think titles that everybody knows, like Into Thin Air, Touching the Void, The Wager, The Wide, Wide Sea now by Hampton Sides, that feature women. Can you think of any? There's so few.
No, I really, but I always have blind spots. I'm always scared to say stuff like that because it just shows that I don't know what I'm talking about. So I'm glad to get back up that I'm halfway right.
Yeah. There are so few, breathtakingly few. And I think that is a huge gap to fill, especially at a time when it doesn't matter where you are in the political spectrum, a time when women's historical accomplishments are literally being erased from the public record. We need these kinds of stories, right? And we need women that are complex. We need stories that show that women can do really impossible things. We need these stories that show men the possibility of heroic women. There's so many reasons, right, that we need to fill this gap in our both historical and literary canon. And so that was, absolutely a huge sort of motivation. But like I was telling you actually before we started recording, is that you can't divorce the gender lens from this story because that's what these women were dealing with, right? It was a big motivation for some of them to do it. But we don't read books like The Wager and Into Thin Air because they're male-focused stories. You read them because they're damn good reads. And that's what I want this to be too. At the end of the day, it is just a really, hopefully, good read.
Oh, and it definitely is. And one of the things that struck me as I was reading it was that throughout the story, all these kind of luminaries of the climbing world pop up, like Royal Robbins and Warren Harding, and then Don Sheldon up there in Alaska. And it's these names that anybody that has spent a lot of time reading or learning about those days of the climbing and alpinism worlds, they know these names. And I thought it was interesting because, like, I know about everything those guys did, and it's all these kind of well-known, well-publicized stories. Yet these women were directly in contact with those guys, and in that same time period, in the same world, and they were doing these unbelievable adventures that are on par or more hardcore than a lot of these guys. Yet I'd never heard of them. I'd never heard of this story. And so you wonder how many other stories are like that, where there are a few people that got a lot of the credit and everybody knows about them, but there are all these other people that are just doing it kind of their way and for whatever reason under the radar, and we just don't know about them. I felt like that was something I really liked about this book.
Yes, it does. I wonder that, and that's selfishly and maybe grandiosely what I hope is that this can be one of those stories that opens the floodgates for all the rest, right? That it gets into the hands of somebody who's like, oh, I have an incredible story that, has never been told, or I know somebody who does, or I heard about this thing in history that is such a footnote, but it deserves more spotlight. And I think that we don't not have any mainstream adventure exploration stories because there were no women doing it. We have it because they weren't writing the history books.
Yeah. I'm going to steal some writing advice from you since I have you here, a captive audience. And I'm curious how you, in the early days, like I guess you did a proposal for this, I'm not sure, but as you were kind of mapping it out in your brain and figuring out, like, all right, how am I going to tell this story? It's such a complicated story, and there's so many moving pieces and so many relationships between so many people that then lead to other things. Yet it never for lack of a better word, it never gets boring. I never got bogged down. Okay. I continue to be kind of pulled through the story, and I can appreciate kind of, in my limited experience, how hard that must be to structure a book like this. So I'm curious, how did you think about structuring this thing? Because it's very complicated, yet it's fun to read. I mean, that's kind of a weird question, but I'd love to hear just about your process of the structure.
And that I have to admit, so I'm a nonfiction writer, but I don't like reading nonfiction usually.
Really?
Unless it has a lot, almost as plot driven, right?
Where, yeah. It always shows.
Yeah. Well, this is where the story unfolds propulsively, where you have people who are like characters and that they have this huge development arc where there's tension and action and it keeps you going. Like, I just don't like boring nonfiction reads. And so that's one reason why I did it this way. And the other reason, though, is that there were 3 of the women on whom there was enough historically of their early lives to set them up for the why and to really accurately and do them justice as complex, complicated people, and then make the climb almost maybe a backdrop for all these different stakes, right? And that was really cool to know. And that's why, I mean, I also can't imagine trying to do that with all 6 of them. So that maybe is lucky for me that on 3 of the women, they're just sort of mysteriously nothing there, right? Until Dana ends up walking onto the page basically halfway through because she kept this incredible expedition journal that was just amazing. And that I actually got really lucky with too. I mean, a lot of mountaineering records, particularly from that time, a lot of journals are not really internal journeys. This is what the weather was like. Here's the route we took. Here's the equipment I wish I'd brought. They're really dry, right? And these women were on these just like complex internal journeys, and they wrote it all down, which is amazing. So I got really lucky, I think, with that. But I really wanted, I mean, it was really important to me, I think, that readers felt like they were inside the heads of these women, along with me, because I got that opportunity, right? And so that was so important to me, that as we get to the parts where these things are happening on the mountain, that really drives these women into crisis mode. And why are they making these decisions? Like, I wanted people to identify with that, because I didn't want anyone to feel one-dimensional, because that's not true, right? So I spent some time setting it up. And yeah, it's interesting. I think I would have spent more time setting it up, and my editor really pulled me back on that. So I had a good editor too.
This is kind of a random question, but you've done so much in the world of adventure and of journalism and telling these stories. And I feel like when I was reading this book, one of the things that popped in my head was how important these letters were and the journals. And then I thought 30 years from now, when people are writing about things that happened, say in the, early 2000s, there aren't going to be any sources, because everything's over email and text. So have you thought about that at all? Like how that's going to work years from now? How are we going to even know what was happening? Because everything's digital and it's just gone. It's either private or it's gone.
Yes, I have thought about that. And I do wonder about it, like what is the record we're leaving behind? It's curated shit on Instagram, right? And which is a tragedy, I think. Yeah, I have definitely thought about that. And what would, if somebody were chronicling, who is somebody, like I was talking to Alex Honnold about this, actually, like if somebody were trying to chronicle Alex Honnold's life, what would they find? And luckily, Alex wrote a book with David Roberts, an incredible writer, one of the best before David Roberts died. So there's that. But otherwise, yeah, there's nothing out there to create what we have been able to create, I think, about the past before and now. Like, what a weird crux moment.
How did this process? I mean, I know you wrote a book, kind of a memoir, on behalf of a woman, a few years ago. And then you obviously just crank out magazine articles like crazy, but I'd love to hear how this process of writing, a pretty hardcore researched book compared in your mind to what you spend a lot of your time, more magazine length, feature length, articles. Was it both from a challenge aspect, but also like, did you like it? How do you like it compared to magazine work?
I love it. I love having a long project to just sink into. It's incredible. And this one, I actually wrote it fairly quickly. I mean, there definitely was a period where I was assembling everything. I have binders that are, 6 inches thick of correspondence. I mean, it was 1970 and we had a lot of phones around, and I swear these never used a phone. They just wrote each other letters, which is fantastic and amazing. And all of the journals and everything. So I had a period of time where it felt like I was spinning my wheels and I just wanted to get to writing. But for me, I know I'm ready to start writing when words start putting themselves together in my head, and I have to get them out before it's too late, right? This urgency. And that happened really quickly with this, that I kind of knew once you start seeing the same events appear in the journals, but then different perspectives, I knew how the story went. And that was really cool. And I love that. And I felt that way when I wrote the hard parts with Oksana Masters, that I had this, and I kind of knew that was coming with 30 Below too. So now I know that after you finish a manuscript like this, there is, and maybe it's part of having been able to sink into the flow state of it, like we were talking about earlier too, over such a long period of time. And you get to recreate this world, and you get to be part of this world for, a year, basically, that then when I finish it, I do have this period of depression, where then the project is over and the world is done, and what's next? But really almost this grief at having to leave it, I think. So yeah, it's a double-edged sword, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, when I came back from my first Denali trip, I was pretty beat up and drained, and there was about a 3-week to month-long period where my then fiance, now wife, thought I was kind of crazy when I came home. Like I was literally like my brain didn't work right. And so after the second trip, we got married. We were engaged to be married, And we planned the wedding exactly 1 month after I got home because we knew I would need a little decompression phase so I wouldn't be like a complete maniac. And I think whenever you're doing something that requires that much focus and that much intensity, whether it's physical or mental or a combo of both, there is a letdown to it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's just kind of the bargain that comes with doing these things, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. It's sort of like makes you feel the most alive at the same time it delivers the grief and loss on a much smaller scale.
Again, weird stuff. Well, I want to hear more about how you ended up doing this work, because I've relied on so much of your writing over the years to prepare for different things I'm doing. And I think about the interview I did a while back with Mike Dehoff, who's doing the Returning Rapids project. And right about the time I was doing that interview, your piece in Rolling Stone came out. And so it was like the best preparation in the world as I was getting ready to talk to Mike. I felt almost like I was cheating because I didn't have to, you wrote such an amazing article. But how, when you were growing up, was writing a big part of your life, creativity, journalism? Like, how did that all come to be such a focus?
I did used to love to write when I was little, and my dad actually is a writer. He never had anything published, but both my parents were teachers, and my dad would write novels at night after we had gone to bed, and they're incredible. And I have been pushing him to return to them, but he kind of, I think, is burned on that. Now just wants to write for himself. But so I'd been exposed to it for sure from the time that I was tiny. And I wrote a lot when I was young, and then I kind of forgot about it. And I spent my 20s bleeding my heart out as an activist. And, that can be so rewarding and also so exhausting. And so I was this total cliche that I think it was 31, and I just needed a break, and I scrimped and saved and quit my nonprofit job where I was not making very much money, saved just enough where I could hitchhike around New Zealand for 6 months to a year if I was really careful with money, and ski and hike, and just, needed a moment to figure out what I wanted to do next. So such a cliche, right? And
a cool cliche though. I think it's awesome.
And I remember this distinctly, where I thought, this just furthers the cliche, that I didn't want to have to email friends and family all separately with updates. And instead I started a blog because that was the thing to do then. And it reminded me how much I loved writing, but it took me a while to get to the point where I thought, okay, could I just do this and could I support myself just on this? Which is a big kind of step, because it also is this idea of and I'm struggling with this now, actually. Like, it has come back pretty hardcore, because I think the book release process is so different than the actual writing, and I hate it, that I don't know if I want to just support myself on writing. But it took me a while to get to this point of, could I make enough money just doing, magazines and writing what I want? And I had other contracts. I was working on public lands and environmental health for a while and writing on the side. And then I decided that I could go full-time writing. I really could do this. And at the time, and still even, content writing, writing for brands or something like that, which pays better, was a big piece of my income. That I could do it. And then COVID hit and everybody contracted their budgets, and I was like, oh no, but I made it through. So, and I don't make a lot of money. I want to change that paradigm where I want to be a really well-paid and wealthy writer. It's a very rare thing, but I think that it's hard now that the industry in a lot of ways doesn't necessarily reward good writing. And you see that kind of in the marketing, that you have to be a celebrity or have done something sensationalized, or, have 100,000 Instagram followers or whatever it is to kind of get to break through. I mean, even my marketing, the head of marketing at my publishing house, I had just a quick check-in call with her, and she was like, marketing is so hard right now. Like, if a new writer comes to me and it is fantastic writing, I know that I can't sell it if they have 500 Instagram followers. And I was like, oh my God, what a knife to the heart. So I'm kind of struggling with it at the moment, I have to admit.
Well, it's definitely a weird time. I mean, you think about, I'm sure you saw all this, the letter that all those folks wrote to Outside Magazine. and just saying they want it off of the masthead because it's turned into such a internet, content. I hate that word, content machine. And then and the guy that runs it, he's like a private equity guy, wrote some silly thing back. And then Hampton Sides, did you see Hampton Sides' email to him?
Yes. So good.
He hammered him. Hampton, if he wasn't already a legend, he cemented his legendary status with that.
I love it.
It's just how do you think about real journalism, like what you do? Like, what is the role of that now in this world where everybody thinks they're an expert and anybody can be claim to be a journalist? Whereas what you do just requires such care, such ethics, such hard work. And then there's some jackass like me who plugs a microphone in his laptop and just starts. So, do you have thought? I'm sure you could write a book about this, but just what is the role and importance of journalism now in this particular weird moment we're in history?
It is an interesting moment. And I have a lot of different sort of and disparate thoughts on it. One, that I think it's never been more important. And we are at a weird point where there is kind of a widespread mistrust of mainstream media, even trusted media. But I have my trusted people that I go to for news or to research. When I'm researching something for a journalistic piece, I don't go to Substack. I don't go to Instagram. I go to the journalists that I trust or the sources, the scientists that I trust, all of that. At the same time that I think that this opportunity for people to just put lovely content out because they want to, like where I think Substack is kind of amazing is that there are people that I follow that I probably would never find anywhere else, right? And you can just go get a quick, absolutely lovely, inspiring read in 5 minutes, which is really cool. Or I think even, which is disparate to what I said first, that one of the journalists that I trust so much that I get my news from is Jessica Yellen. And she is living on Substack and Instagram right now. But I trust her because she spent so much time at all of these really just incredible institutions. So I don't know. It's a really interesting time to be in where there's so much just like bite-sized, short-term, like short videos that are just destroying our brains. And less people, I think, are reading those big 10,000 word pieces in the New Yorker, the Atlantic that I absolutely love. So I don't know. It's a really weird time. Like, what do you think about it?
I feel like the individual has taken on the power over the institution. Like you see all these people that used to be at, say, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or whatever kind of big institutional, that 20 years ago, they were the authority on things. And it was the New York Times. It was not the individual writers at the New York Times. And now it's all about the individual. Like I think about Barry Weiss, for example, who runs the Free Press. And she was at the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and she became a sensation by herself. And so she went off and started her own media brand based around her. And I think, you can look at, everybody from Joe Rogan to, anybody. And it's all about the people. It's not about an institution. And you see it in universities as well. Like it's just come down to these, and it's just getting more and more and more and more fractured. I think everything, there used to be 3 news networks, 3 TV stations, and then there were 100, and now there are 300. And there used to be 2 social media networks, Twitter and Facebook, and now there's 50 of them. And so it's almost like you think about a family tree, and it just gets more and more spread out. And I feel like everything is just getting more fragmented. And when that happens, there's just not a role for institutions anymore, is what it seems like to me.
Right. Yeah.
But I don't know anything. You can tell me if that's a dumb answer.
No, I think it's so true. And like with the fractured part too, it means that we all get to choose what we believe, and you get to choose to consume the things that only support your own viewpoint. Right. So it's harder, I think, to open your mind unless you go searching for it. Even what's really interesting in my, and again, I'm contradicting what I said first, in my Instagram feed, I have intentionally followed different news sources. So I follow the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and also some more right. I mean, even the Wall Street Journal is more right, than the New York Times. And because of the algorithm, I have to go find the Wall Street Journal. It does not show up in my feed. So you have to be so intentional about it. And yeah, so I don't know. And I also think it's interesting going back to just plain storytelling and books. I mean, we are being fed content through a fire hose right now, right? Like you can get it everywhere. And so how do you tune out the noise? And do you have to be really intentional about going to find the good storytelling that you like? How do you find it? It's just, I don't know. It's a wilderness.
It is. It really is. I think that's a perfect description because it is. There's just so much. And then there's even if there was just that much fracture and that many options of ways to get information, that'd be crazy. But then the fact that it's the mechanisms for spreading it are basically alive. And they know what you want to see, or they think they know what you want to see, and they feed you this stuff. It's
that's a creepy way and so true to think about.
I think of it as alive. Like I think about different information, and when I'm thinking about what is very poisonous for my brain, and it's I have 3 levels, and level 3 is the alive version, and it's things that are reacting to me, and I try to limit that shit.
Whoa, yeah, good call.
Well, it's easy to say it; it's harder to do it. So people who've been listening to this now, they realize that you and I, we're clear thinking people. We can hold 3 or 4 different ideas in our head at once, and if they've listened this far, they're probably not going to get mad. But I have to ask about this silly nonsense about changing the name back and forth.
Yes,
and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that because I've never called it Mount McKinley ever. And I've been up the damn thing twice. I'm pretty connected to the thing. And now it's like, I don't know if it's against the law to call it Mount McKinley or what, but talk to me about your thoughts on this renaming nonsense.
Yes, I think it is absolute histrionics. And I think that history supports the fact that nobody will call it McKinley on a widespread basis. And nobody did over the first time it was called that. So if readers want a very quick primer, McKinley was renamed from Denali. And Denali is the Koyukon Athabascan word that means the Great One. And that name, Denali, had already been imprinted on the American mind for years before Congress renamed it in 1917 McKinley for a president who had never seen it and had no connection to Alaska, and only because a gold prospector had come out of the wilderness and heard that McKinley was running for Congress at the time. So there's no absolute nonsensical rename, but it's really rare that indigenous names persist in mainstream vocabulary after colonialist renames. But Denali, I think, did because it was already entwined with mountaineering. And so, the first expeditions to go for the mountain were so romanticized. And by the time it was finally climbed in the early 1900s successfully, it became synonymous, the word Denali, with this kind of grand and far wild that was part of the American mythos, even though most Americans would never see it, right? And so when it was renamed, even over the almost century that it was called McKinley, Alaskans, mountaineers, even Bradford Washburn, who almost religiously called it McKinley, still called it Denali in several senses, actually. And Bradford Washburn was this really just legendary mountaineer who was the first to fully map the enormity of the mountain. And he even still called it Denali. And so in 2015, when Obama restored the name Denali, he really was just confirming the long reach of its indigenous name in the American vocabulary. And so I think when Trump made this announcement that was going to be one of the first things that he did, I just thought, what an ineffectual thing. What a thing to show that although you're sort of decreeing this, nobody's going to listen. Like, what an interesting thing to choose. But, the reason that he chose that is because McKinley loved tariffs and he expanded the American territory with Guam and the Philippines. And so, of course, he's a champion of Trump. But I also just think, what an unintentional slap in the face that it is and always will be Denali.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because I didn't even know. I mean, when I climbed it, it would have been '08, '09. And I had no idea that wasn't the real name of it. And then Obama, I mean, I just figured that was the name of it. It's just, I don't know, it's so silly, man. Well, I'm curious, one other kind of question about your influences and writers. I'd love to know any writers that you admire that have been influential in your work, that you maybe have modeled bits and pieces of their process and their writing on yours. Like who are authors that you admire?
Oh, authors. Well, writers, I have to say John Branch at the New York Times, and I have sent him.
He's been on this podcast?
Oh, I have listened to that. Yes.
Oh, good. He's awesome.
He is incredible. He is one of my heroes, man. When he wrote that snowfall piece in the New York Times about the Stevens Pass avalanche, that was just a whole new way to look at journalism, I was floored. So John Branch.
Yeah, he won the Pulitzer Prize for that.
Oh my God. Yeah. So just absolutely amazing piece of work. And then other authors, I mean, of course, I love Kevin Fedarko. I think The Emerald Mile is one of the rare pieces of nonfiction that I could not put down. And yeah, we both know Fedarko is amazing. And then I think there are some other writers that I love. Caroline Van Hemert. She wrote The Sun is a Compass, another nonfiction book that I absolutely love. She's a biologist and a beautiful writer.
Brendan Leonard told me to read that a long time ago, and I'd forgotten about it until now. He said it's one of his favorites.
Oh my gosh, it's absolutely incredible. I love it so much. But otherwise, like authors that I can't stop thinking about, like have nothing to do with nonfiction. Like I think Tom Robbins is one of the best writers ever. Like what he did with Skinny Legs and All is just absolutely incredible. Or I just read The Heart in Winter by Kevin Barry, and that redefined fiction for me. It is a short book, and it took me so long to read it because I would go back and reread whole passages. It was just so incredibly beautiful, and it's based in Butte, and I live in Montana, and I loved it. It's free right now to listen to on Spotify, which is unfair. Hopefully he's still making a lot of money because he should be valued for his writing. But he has this thick Irish accent. And so I'd started listening to it on Spotify and then realized I needed to read it. I wanted to consume it just with my brain that way. And as I started reading it, I could only hear his thick Irish accent in my brain as I was reading it. And I loved that. And Maggie Shipstead, I think, who has written The Great Circle and Astonish Me and Seating Arrangements, is one of the most amazing novelists out there today.
Those are great. Do you both read and listen to them, or do you prefer one over the other?
I prefer reading. And I think often because the narration isn't what I hope that it will be, unless the author themselves are reading it, which is a lot of authors don't because it's such a process. It's so long. Yeah,
that's how I am. I can't listen to, I get bored. I zone out. But if I found that every now and then, if I find one that the actual author's reading it, it keeps my attention, which is interesting.
Yes, totally. Yes.
Two more questions for you. One, I'm sure there will be a lot of people listening to this that are, they want to be professional writers. They have dreams of writing, and making it, their full-time job in a lot of ways. What would be your advice? I'm sure you get questions about this all the time, but to people like up and coming or people looking for a career change that are interested in that, because you make it very clear, like it's not easy. It's not for the faint of heart. What's your kind of standard advice for folks that have dreams of or are aspiring writers?
Yes, I remember some advice that another writer I had reached out to. He had been writing for a long time for National Geographic. When I reached out to him when I was kind of getting started, and he told me, he's also teaches at a university, this advice that I pass on, which is you have to have an elephant's skin, because particularly if you're freelancing like I do, but I think in general. And he was saying that in the context of pitching. So pitching magazines, pitching books, rejection is part of the game. And it's so much more part of the game than acceptance is. I've been doing this for years and I've written for big places. And I think that my pitches get rejected 90% of the time, right? So, and you have to not take that personally, which is a very difficult thing to do because writing is a very personal thing. Those are your ideas, right? It's really hard to say, okay, that idea didn't work, or that person didn't like my idea, which might not be the case. There are so many factors, but so there's that piece, I think, of the elephant skin and just breaking in and having pieces published if you want to make money off it. But then I also think that writing is such a vulnerable craft. It's so vulnerable. I mean, even this book is not about me, right? 30 Below has nothing to do with me, but it is a craft. And it's really difficult, I think, if you want to make money off it, to separate the craft itself from how the craft performs. And that is, I think, a big piece of having the elephant skin. And I think you have to do it because you can't escape the doing of it. I don't think that maybe you can, I don't know. You can go into writing or any sort of art and do it because you want to make money. I think you have to do it because you can't not do it.
I think that is, in all the different folks that I've spoken to over the years, that's a common theme. And I like that. Final question. I always like to open it up. If I missed anything, if you have any kind of parting words of wisdom, anything that I blatantly said wrong or overlooked, how would you like to wrap it up?
I want to wrap it up by thanking you, Ed, because I have listened to so many writers on this podcast and other people, activists, like just incredible people. But writers in particular, I remember listening to Peter Heller on this podcast, Hampton Sides. I mean, people who are just like so legendary. And you just, thank you for elevating the craft and elevating the people doing it. And your conversations are always so authentic. And I mean, yours is one of the very few podcasts that I listen to on a regular basis. And so thank you for bringing all these people into my consciousness.
Well, thank you for agreeing to spend your time talking to me. This thing wouldn't be anything I'm just the guy ask questions. All these amazing people are the ones that make it cool. So I love the book. I love hanging out with you. I'll be in Montana in June. And so hopefully I'll see you in Missoula. Yes. But tell Mr. Ben I say hello. Y'all are awesome. And I just really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you so much.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. 1 email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.